The God Within. Physics, cosmology, consciousness, and the search for truth. I've always admired physicists. They seek answers by asking questions of nature, and when they follow a rigorous scientific approach to the quest for knowledge, they refuse to be sidelined by dogma, personal belief, or trickery. Science, in its most pure form, is about the search for truth. I'm not referring to the bastardization of science by modern corporations which use the language of science to push a kind of intellectual tyranny involving for-profit GMOs, vaccines, and pharmaceuticals. I'm talking about pure, non-corporate driven science and the quest for human understanding. This search for human understanding has led me through a number of fascinating areas of study, but I've found the most fertile ground for exploration in the fields of quantum physics, the many worlds interpretation, and the study of consciousness. Along that path, I decided to read a book by famed physicist Stephen Hawking and co-author Leonard Mlodinow. As a fan of Hawking's work over the years, I relished the idea of reading his explanations of the theory of everything, the grand design, the invisible hand behind it all. What I found in his book, however, rather surprised me. On the very first page of the book, I found myself quite disappointed in the apparent lack of understanding of the universe from someone as intellectually capable as Hawking. As you'll soon see, his words reflect what can only be called the great failing of modern-day physics to address the meaning behind the math. Far too many mainstream physicists seem stuck in what can only be called the Newtonian era of consciousness. That is, they don't yet grasp the idea that consciousness exists at all. Keep listening and you'll see quotes about this directly from Hawking himself. Conventional physics is a lot like conventional medicine. Hawking's book, The Grand Design, did serve another useful purpose in my search for understanding. It nicely summarized the outmoded view of conventional physics. This mainstream view of physics is to reality what conventional medicine is to healing. In other words, it has all the technical jargon but none of the soul, and so it misses the whole point. Stated another way, conventional physics is the clever conglomeration of high-level mathematics desperately seeking to avoid any discussion of what it all means. You're not allowed to talk about consciousness, or free will, or the spooky connectedness that has been experimentally demonstrated to exist between all things in the universe, because that brings up too many questions that make conventional physicists uncomfortable. Questions about God, or the intersection of intention with the physical universe, or free will. They even have a name for their cover story. It's called the Copenhagen Interpretation, and it can be summarized as "shut up and calculate." The Copenhagen interpretation of quantum physics is essentially an intellectual security blanket under which physicists can focus on the narrow mathematics of their calculations without having to be bothered by the bigger questions that inevitably invoke the realm of philosophy. That's where Stephen Hawking's book begins, by the way. On page 1, he writes, "Philosophy is dead. Philosophy has not kept up with modern developments in science, particularly physics." Philosophy is dead? It's a stunning statement, not so much in its abruptness, but in its arrogance, which presumes that philosophy's success can only be measured by the degree to which it keeps up with physics. Conventional physicists, it turns out, largely believe that physics alone can explain everything. The grand design, as it goes, will become apparent if we can only work out the math. The mystery of being will be understood through the study of subatomic particles and the tiny fractions of moments that unfurled immediately after the Big Bang. One chapter in Hawking's book is actually named The Theory of Everything. Really? Everything? Not just physics stuff, but everything else, too? I find that a bit hard to believe, given that a typical quantum physicist probably doesn't even know what's in a hot dog, much less the entire universe. But please excuse my attempt at humor. Just so you know, I'm taking this seriously. Let's consider the definition of physics itself. The Collins English Dictionary defines physics as the branch of science concerned with the properties of matter and energy and the relationships between them. It is based on mathematics and traditionally includes mechanics, optics, electricity, and magnetism, acoustics, and heat. There is no dictionary that defines physics as the study of all that is. I've checked. The very idea that physics accounts for everything actually seems, well, a bit arrogant. But that's not new in the field of physics either. Top physicists have a long history of thinking they had it all figured out. "There is nothing new to be discovered in physics now," uttered Lord Kelvin in 1894. He continued, "All that remains is more and more precise measurement." The God particle isn't a particle. Stephen Hawking is a brilliant man in his field and probably a very sincere and well-meaning human being on top of that. But as brilliant as he may be in the world of physics, he has misunderstood the boundaries of one particular approach to the search for truth. To say philosophy is dead is to disavow the big questions philosophy seeks to answer, questions that cannot be asked through the study of physics alone. What is consciousness? Is there a God? What happens after death? How do we know what we know? What does it mean to exist? Can love be measured? How does consciousness interact with matter and energy? For what purpose, if any, are we here? Are these questions now considered so unimportant that the entire branch of knowledge-seeking under which they appear is to be discarded by conventional physicists? Or is it that physicists believe firing up the nearest super collider will magically reveal their desperately sought God particle, which will answer all the questions for them? The Copenhagen interpretation, remember, provides a convenient exit for avoiding tackling these questions at all. Shut up and calculate, but don't ask anything too spooky. The fact that the ever so mysterious God particle is even named the God particle is, by itself, an enlightening commentary on the disappointing degree of delusion now running rampant through the conventional physics community. The God particle name is wrong on both counts. It isn't God, and it's not even a particle. In fact, the branch of physics known as particle physics doesn't study particles at all, as any practical physicist will readily admit. Every time they look for particles, they only see vibrating waves of energy, or flickering hints of structured probability waves that vanish in billionths of a second. What does seem to be found behind the curtain of so-called particle physics is, to the great surprise of many scientists, the ever-mysterious issue of consciousness. Consciousness is what appears to collapse waves of probability into seemingly real particles in our seemingly real world. Without consciousness, the observer, there's nothing to translate the apparent laws of physics into observable, testable events in the first place. And at a deeper level, there is exciting evidence now emerging which hints that consciousness is physics, in a way similar to E equals mc squared, which of course explains that energy is matter, just in a different form. What becomes increasingly clear in all this is that physics cannot be fully explained without taking consciousness into consideration. And that's a rabbit hole most conventional physicists don't wish to explore, at least not when their careers and academic reputations are on the line. We are all just robots. Stephen Hawking does not believe in consciousness, nor free will. He quite literally believes we are all just deterministic robot machines who behave as if we were biological puppets, driven by predictable and mechanistic biochemical impulses. Here's what he says. Though we feel that we can choose what we do, our understanding of the molecular basis of biology shows that biological processes are governed by the laws of physics and chemistry, and therefore are as determined as the orbits of the planets. Recent experiments in neuroscience support the view that it is our physical brain, following the known laws of science that determines our actions, and not some agency that exists outside those laws. And there you have it. Hawking stating that he utterly denies the existence of the mind, or consciousness, or a connection with spirit, or anything other than the deterministic clockwork of biochemical determinism that he calls our brain. Hawking is not alone in this bizarre belief, of course. The vast majority of conventional scientists and physicists also believe that human beings are mere biochemical robots with no souls, no consciousness, and no free will. Francis Crick, the co-discoverer of DNA, said that awareness was nothing more than a feeling generated in the brain. He says, your joys and sorrows, your memories and your ambitions, your sense of personal identity and free will, are in fact no more than the behavior of a vast assembly of nerve cells and their associated molecules. He wrote that in his book, The Astonishing Hypothesis. But if Hawking and Crick and most other conventional scientists believe that they themselves are biochemical robots with no souls and no free will, then who do they believe wrote their books? Was Hawking's grand design book merely a spontaneous regurgitation of neurological ricochets cascading through his head without any intention behind them? And if so, then the book must, by definition, be a mindless account of physics. Or more precisely, in writing that human beings are biochemical robots, Hawking hasn't merely lost his mind, he never believed he had one to begin with. To call Hawking mindless is to agree with his own hypothesis. This isn't a verbal snipe at Hawking, by the way. It is a highly accurate description of his own beliefs, practically in his own words, as you will soon see. To further support the notion that human beings are all biochemical robots with no minds and no free will, he offers a rather faulty argument, saying the following. A study of patients undergoing awake brain surgery found that by electrically stimulating the appropriate regions of the brain, one could create in the patient the desire to move the hand, arm, or foot, or to move the lips and talk. From this, he leaps to the conclusion that we have no free will. This is a fallacious and illogical argument from the outset. I can tie a string to your toe and pull it around as if you were a puppet, but that doesn't mean that you can't decide to move that same toe on your own through conscious intention translated into your human body through your brain. The mind, you see, works by being translated through the brain, which is a biological organ. The brain, in turn, controls the physical body. But artificially inducing a muscle movement through the electrical stimulation of the brain, or the muscles themselves, only proves that there is a biological component to our existence, not that the biological component is the entirety of our being. For example, if you capture my remote-controlled helicopter, you can easily cause the rotor motor to turn by applying electrodes to the motor's contact points. But I can also control those same motors on the helicopter by broadcasting a command signal from my controlling device located some distance away. Your ability to artificially induce motor activity through the use of electrodes does not disprove an internal, even an invisible, command link to the same hardware. The only thing the brain stimulation experiment demonstrates is that the hardware of the human brain can be artificially stimulated. Well, that's not surprising. It says nothing about the software, or possibly even the computing cloud, that is also capable of driving that hardware through free will. By Hawking's argument, the fact that a doctor can hammer your knee and cause a literal knee-jerk reaction somehow bolsters the false belief that we have no consciousness or free will. It is a baseless argument. Lest you think I am misinterpreting Hawking's conclusion on this matter, he sums it all up nicely with this statement. It is hard to imagine how free will can operate if our behavior is determined by physical law. So it seems that we are no more than biological machines, and that free will is just an illusion. I couldn't explain it any more plainly. Like the majority of conventional physicists, Hawking believes we are deterministic robots who lack free will, consciousness, and anything you might call a mind. This belief, as you will soon see, is a very dangerous belief. It has huge implications for the very way we value life on our planet and throughout the universe. The dangerous philosophy of determinism. Determinism is an extremely dangerous philosophy because, by definition, it absolves people from all responsibility for their own actions. If you believe in determinism, you are logically forced to believe there is no such thing as a criminal, because those who choose to commit violent crimes are merely biochemical robots who pursue such actions through no fault of their own. They can't help it, in other words. Determinism is the magic get-out-of-jail-free card sought by every defense attorney who is trying to get his murderous client declared innocent. The frequently invoked plea of insanity, of course, is a classic citation of brain-based determinism. It seeks to absolve the criminal of his actions based on the idea that he did not have any presence of mind in committing those crimes in the first place. He was not, in essence, self-aware. His criminal actions were merely the result of biochemical cause and effect, his lawyers would argue. Now, Hawking believes we are all effectively qualified for that same plea of insanity, because in his mind, we are all deterministic biochemical robots who have no free will, no consciousness, no soul, and therefore no responsibility for our current actions. But what about future actions? If we are biochemical machines, it would seem that we could be held accountable to pre-crime. Because, as Hawking openly states, if we knew the complete molecular state of someone's brain today, we could perfectly predict every thought and action they would take in the future. Thus, by accurately assessing someone's brain today, with a brain scan, for example, technology could pinpoint exactly who would commit a future act that would break society's laws. That person could therefore be arrested for having the present state of mind that doctors claim would lead to future crime. This leads to an absurd ethical contradiction, which means that people aren't responsible for their present actions, but they can be held accountable for future actions they haven't even committed. Such is the distortion of determinism. But the belief that human beings lack souls or consciousness is dangerous for a far more serious reason. It can provide a scientific basis for the commission of heinous crimes against humanity, including genocide. From Hawking's point of view of soulless determinism, there is no reason why the United Nations, for example, can't reduce regional overpopulation by simply committing genocide against human beings through population reduction programs. Because humans aren't real people with souls and consciousness, the poisoning of them does not violate any real ethical boundaries according to that line of thinking. This is not an outlandish scenario. Currently, the United States Department of Agriculture, the USDA, operates a mass avian euthanasia program in the United States called Bye Bye Blackbird. Under that program, the USDA poisons literally millions of birds each year and engages in the routine extermination of cougars, falcons, owls, foxes, beavers, wild pigs, and other animals. This is all carried out under the presumption that animals have no consciousness and thus murdering them is of no ethical consequence. If the United States government already engages in the murderous management of animal species that it perceives as becoming too populous, then by extension, the same approach to managing human populations would quite easily be justified under a philosophical belief that human beings are mere biological animals too. This is just one of the many reasons why this idea that human beings are mindless machines with no consciousness or free will is the perfect pretext for the mass killing of human beings by any government that embraces this thinking. That's one of the many reasons why Hawking is such a dangerous person. The wrongness of his ideas are only matched by the influence of his writings. The very fact that he is so widely respected is what makes his ideas so potentially dangerous, because at any point, a government could latch on to his human beings are not conscious philosophy and commit heinous genocidal acts while calling it all scientific and clutching Hawking's books as if they were Bibles. Adolf Hitler would have welcomed such a philosophy, of course. It's all the easier to poison millions of Jews if you don't think of them as human beings and instead consider them to be mindless, robotic machines waiting to be exterminated. If Hawking's book had existed at the time of Hitler, Nazi crimes would have no doubt been carried out under the name of science, and the idea that Jews were mere soulless animals to be exterminated at will would have been branded a scientific idea as well, and anyone who opposed that idea would have been called unscientific. Behind every madman, there is a distorted philosophy that denies people their humanity. Stephen Hawking turns out to be a strong proponent of this very thing, denying people their humanity. It is no coincidence, by the way, that science, which gave us the atomic bomb and other technologies with which to carry out mass genocide, has also given us the philosophical pretext under which that genocide may be justified. Remember, too, that on the first page of his book, Hawking complained that ethics hasn't kept up with physics. But a closer inspection of the subject reveals quite the opposite. Physics actually hasn't kept up with ethics. The recognition of the existence of free will and consciousness is the foundation of compassion for all living things. It is the core principle from which the vast majority of ethics spring. No human civilization can achieve lasting peace without the acknowledgement that human beings have consciousness and free will, and yet these are the very ideas that are now branded as unscientific by the vast majority of the conventional scientific community. They didn't just leave God out of their equations, you see. They left out our humanity as well. Under the brand of science, we are all meaningless, soulless, biochemical robots who have all fooled ourselves into thinking that we are somehow self-aware. Self-awareness and observing the observer. I find it odd to be criticizing an eminent physicist over the issue of consciousness. Yet despite the fact that Hawking is one of the most renowned thinkers in the world, I stand firm in the belief that to deny the existence of consciousness in fellow human beings is a dangerous, dark pathway that can only lead to suffering and death. It is, in essence, a denial of the value of life itself. That is why, on this point in particular, Hawking is wrong. Dead wrong, to be more specific. Even worse, Hawking is providing a justification for the mass killing of plants, animals, and even human beings, all under the name of science, because if consciousness is only an illusion, then even suffering is not real, and the ethical treatment of fellow human beings, an idea grounded in the religious texts of all major world religions, by the way, is immediately rendered null and void. A rogue government, and which government isn't rogue these days, it seems, could take these writings and use them as the scientific basis for committing unspeakable horrors against humanity. But how do I know Hawking is truly wrong on this point? A skeptic of everything I've said here might ask, quite correctly, how do you know there is free will and consciousness reflected throughout the living beings in our universe? The honest answer is that I cannot know with certainty that other beings possess free will and consciousness. I can only know that I possess free will and consciousness. I can't disprove the notion, to offer a seemingly unlikely example, that everybody else is actually just a highly complex biological robot placed here for the sole purpose of entertaining me, the single and sole conscious being in the universe. It seems silly, doesn't it? A far more likely explanation is that some or even most human beings do possess souls and consciousness. However, I do believe it is possible that there are some soulless humans walking among us who operate without consciousness, without self-awareness, and who are incapable of grasping derivative concepts such as compassion or empathy. Those soulless, mindless people tend to either end up as pathological violent criminals or corporate executives of powerful multinational organizations such as drug companies or biotech seed manufacturers. This is perhaps why the actions of so many corporations we see today place no value on human life. These corporations may actually be led by soulless biochemical robots who operate with practical intelligence but lack anything resembling a conscience. These biological human robots would very well fit the description of humans that Hawking presents. The trouble with Hawking's theory, though, is that he applies it to everyone. And while none of us can be absolutely sure about the state of consciousness in others, those of us which possess a sense of self-awareness can be certain that Hawking is wrong about us. The next obvious question, then, is how do I know that I possess consciousness and free will? Francis Crick and most other conventional neurologists believe that consciousness is an illusion created by certain neurons in the brain. If they could just find the consciousness neurons, they would have consciousness explained, they believe. This is a case of reductionism ad absurdum. Answering that is easy, actually. Consciousness is revealed through the realization of self-awareness, which is the waking equivalent of lucid dreaming. To awaken in a dream and recognize the active role of your own mind in creating the dream is one level of consciousness awakening. To achieve the same thing at a higher level, the waking level, is to realize the existence of one's own consciousness. This is sometimes referred to as being enlightened. It is a process achieved not through mathematics, but through self-reflection, observing the observer, if you will. Instead of shut up and calculate, it's more like shut up and meditate. Free will flows naturally from self-realized consciousness, because a self-realized being can decide to do almost anything at any moment without cause. This is the defining element. Consciousness allows a brain to receive intent and carry out that intent without an underlying physical cause. Rather, the cause is an intention expressed through consciousness, reflected through the physical brain interface, which translates between consciousness and perception, and then carried out by the limbs and muscles in this physical world. This cause phenomenon, if you will, originates outside the realm of physics, and thus its detection will forever elude physicists. This is an important concept to grasp, that the universe is not deterministic, and that thoughts and intentions can be created without the presence of a physics-based cause. The study of physics alone, then, will forever fail in detecting, describing, or understanding the nature of the mind and consciousness. I can decide to speak a random series of letters, for example, without any particular cause. N, #, A, Z, 7, U, asterisk, H, ampersand, E, and so on. There is no physical deterministic explanation behind my selection of those letters. They emerged entirely as acts of free will, brought into this physical universe through the translation of the mind through the physical brain, which controls my voice. The collision of consciousness and matter. Every act of free will, by the way, is an integral part of the creation of the universe itself. Without conscious observation, many quantum theorists believe the universe would not exist at all. Quote, "Observations not only disturb what is to be measured, they produce it," said Pascual Jordan, one of the founders of quantum theory. This thought disturbed Einstein, who famously said, "I like to think that the moon is there even if I am not looking at it." But as quantum theory has now convincingly demonstrated, Einstein based his wish on the principles of two things: reality, that things exist on their own, separate from conscious observation, and separability, that matter and energy can exist in isolation, unconnected to anything else. Both of these ideas, reality and separability, have now been conclusively proven false by both quantum theory and quantum experimentation. Scientific realism, more carefully defined, is the thesis that the objects of scientific knowledge exist and act independently of the knowledge of them. This belief has, as mentioned above, been demonstrated false. Quantum theory and reliable experiments based on quantum theory tells us that there is no such thing as a, quote, real object that exists in isolation without being influenced by other things, nor that it even exists as a real thing without being observed. As theoretical physicist John Wheeler explained, quote, no microscopic property is a property until it is an observed property. Furthermore, the separability question has also been conclusively answered. There is no separability in our universe. As physicists Bruce Rosenblum and Fred Kuttner state in their book Quantum Enigma, any two objects that have ever interacted are forever entangled. The behavior of one instantaneously influences the other, and the behavior of everything entangled with either. Our world has a mysterious universal connectedness that goes beyond what we usually consider physical forces. What all this tells us is not only that we are conscious, self-aware beings who influence the very existence of the things around us, but that our consciousness also affects the entire universe. What we choose to say or think or carry out through our actions sends ripples of reality coursing through the vast sea of matter and energy that is our universe. Not only can we influence everything in the universe instantaneously with our minds, but the laws of quantum physics reveal that we cannot help but do so. We are, quite literally, one with the universe. This realization gives rise to a far kinder and more useful philosophy than the so-called science offered by Hawking, who believes that human beings are soulless, mindless, biochemical robots. The belief that every living, conscious being in the universe is inherently connected to every other living being in the universe gives rise to a philosophy of compassion, valuing life and seeking peaceful ways to resolve conflict. It even leads logically to the principles found in many religions. Treat others as you would wish to be treated. Why? Because you are, through the fabric of reality, connected to them as they are to you. To harm another living being, as the Buddhists would say, is to harm yourself. To express compassion toward another conscious living being is to express love and compassion for yourself in the same instant. And on a personal note, I would add that conscious living beings also include animals and plants. Origins of the universe. Any serious inquiry into the nature of the universe ultimately leads to the origin of the universe. On this subject, as with the subject of consciousness, conventional physicists fail to offer enlightenment. Instead of offering a mechanism by which the universe may have begun, they insist the universe spontaneously and without cause created itself out of nothing for no particular reason. Hawking writes about this in The Grand Design. But before we discuss that, allow me to explain the context of this idea first. When you talk to conventional physicists, they calmly explain that the universe follows certain laws or rules of nature. The law of gravity, for example, is one such law. There are laws concerning the conservation of momentum, chaos theory, thermodynamics, the behavior of light, and so on. This is all widely accepted, as most of us would agree the universe does appear to follow certain laws. But when you ask where those laws came from and how they came about, indeed how the universe itself came about, you get a giant fudge factor called the Big Bang. Anything that physicists, and astrophysicists in particular, don't understand seems to get swept under the Big Bang rug. Don't know where the first hydrogen really came from? Don't worry. It all got magically and spontaneously created in the moments after the Big Bang. And where was the Big Bang before it went bang? Well, it was nowhere, because the Big Bang created space, too. And what caused the Big Bang? Nothing. The Big Bang spontaneously caused itself, without any apparent reason or intention. That seems pretty far-fetched in a universe that's supposed to follow laws. So to answer all of this, Hawking writes, quote, "Because there is a law like gravity, the universe can and will create itself from nothing in the manner described in Chapter 6. Spontaneous creation is the reason there is something rather than nothing." The obvious reference to spontaneous creation here deserves some discussion. Wasn't it physicists who have been berating the God-believing creationists over their belief in spontaneous creation? God didn't create the universe, they insist. The Big Bang did. And how did the Big Bang come about? Spontaneous creation. They might as well just add "by God" after the phrase, it seems, since they have now adopted the very same argument put forth by creationists for so long. I am not Catholic, but I will point out the Catholic Church has for many years stated that the Big Bang is entirely consistent with creationism because God created the Big Bang, which gave rise to everything else. Actually, the idea that God, or a sufficiently intelligent and advanced being of some sort, caused the Big Bang is one of the more promising theories of where it all came from. It makes a lot more sense than the idea that it just kind of created itself out of nothing without any reason or cause. But we'll get to that later. Back to Hawking's quote. The logic of his statement just shatters at the slightest probing. Because there is a law like gravity, he says, the universe will create itself? This is illogical. It's a lot like saying, because my car's brakes follow the laws of physics, they will therefore create themselves out of nothing. That would certainly be convenient, since I wouldn't need to replace the brake pads, but I doubt they're going to magically appear just because they follow some of the laws of physics. In fact, it would seem that a set of brakes magically appearing out of nothing would violate the laws of physics. But Hawking says, quote, "Bodies such as stars and black holes cannot just appear out of nothing, but a whole universe can." That's his quote, by the way. He says the universe will create itself from nothing. Where there was once nothing, there is suddenly everything. And even the everything we think we have found is only about 4% of all the stuff, of which 96% is dark matter and dark energy, according to physicists, who have so far failed to find any of it, by the way. Now, this idea that something can be created out of seemingly nothing isn't actually far-fetched as long as there's some input involved, energy, for example. If energy is entered into the equation as the causal force behind the Big Bang, then there's a reasonable explanation for how the Big Bang might have come about. Essentially, the rational explanation is that God, or a sufficiently advanced alien civilization, sprouted the Big Bang by injecting a tremendous amount of energy into a single point in multidimensional space, and we are now the inhabitants of a giant ant farm experiment the size of the whole universe. This is actually one of the most promising explanations for the origin of our universe. The other leading explanation, and I'm not kidding, is that our universe exists as a grand simulation operating inside a highly advanced computing system of some sort belonging to an alien race of beings that is billions of years more advanced than we are. There is actually some serious evidence to support this notion. Planck's constant seems to hint at a physical resolution limit of the apparent physical universe, where objects and energies are quantized in much the same way as pixels on a display monitor in our modern computing world. There's also the fact that the closer you begin to look at matter and energy, the more it all appears to be made of computations. What we believe to be physical matter is actually little more than an organized wave of probability computations, a fact that becomes more apparent the more closely we examine what matter is made of. This grand computer simulation explanation also explains God rather nicely, an all-powerful, omniscient intelligence that presides over the universe. That would, of course, be the programmer of the simulation we now inhabit. There is no logical reason why God himself could not be an emissary from a highly advanced alien civilization that created our universe as a curious experiment. In fact, such a scenario fits nicely with the widely accepted definition of God, a being beyond the stars, who created the universe, and who presides over it with seemingly endless power. God is to our universe as you are to the characters in SimCity. The little sim beings of SimCity are not conscious beings as you are, but if you could imagine them to have consciousness, It's not hard to see how amazed they would be at the miraculous powers of you, their God from above, who can spontaneously create buildings out of nothing. Now, if one of your SimCity citizens were to look at you during the game, actually speak to you and say, "I realize I'm in a simulated game and I'd like to get out," climb out of the monitor and see the world from your point of view, that would be the SimCity equivalent of enlightenment. That is probably how some transcendent meditation masters appear to the actual creators of our universe. But if an advanced alien civilization gave rise to our universe, either as a grand computer simulation or as a, quote, real phenomenon sprouted out of nothing through the Big Bang, then why would such an intelligence stop at merely one universe? If God is all-powerful, in other words, then clearly he's powerful enough to create more than one universe. It follows, then, that a sufficiently advanced alien civilization, or God, if you will, would seed multiple universes in much the same way that we might seed a flower bed with a handful of seeds. Each one of those universes, which I will now call multiverses to avoid confusion of the term universe, which must encompass everything, might experience a Big Bang with slight variations in the laws of physics. In some multiverses, for example, Planck's constant is a smaller number, giving rise to a higher resolution of matter in that multiverse. In other multiverses, the atomic weight of hydrogen might be slightly different, drastically altering the development of stars, planets, black holes, and other cosmological phenomena. In a few of those multiverses, conditions would be just right to support the development of galaxies, stars, and planets that also support life. And on some of those planets, conditions would be just right for the development of carbon-based biological life as we know it here on Earth. It is those planets that would merit special attention from the advanced alien intelligence, it seems, because, well, life is interesting. And for what other purpose would there be to create a series of multiverses in the first place, if not to examine life? Life is interesting stuff, and life on Earth is undoubtedly just one case among countless other life-supporting planets across not merely our galaxy and not only our multiverse, but potentially countless other multiverses which are beyond our present ability to even describe, much less detect or explore. All we really know is that we exist in a matrix of laws and rules of nature, and that we have somehow been granted a degree of self-awareness necessary to pull ourselves out of ignorance and toward the ultimate goal. That goal is as self-evident as consciousness itself, to finally understand who we are, how we came to exist, and what our purpose is for being here, if any. To know ourselves, in other words. Because the real grand design goes far beyond merely figuring out the mathematics behind the fabric of reality. It is a design of consciousness, of connection, and of limitless power to influence all that is through the power of our minds. As we were created in His image, we each possess a fraction of the power of God, a slice of omniscient, conscious godliness. We have only forgotten our connectedness and have been fooled into thinking we are separate from each other and the world around us. The ultimate answers may already exist within us, if we find the courage to look within rather than focusing our questions on the world out there. Because quantum physics now tells us what we find in the universe around us is merely a reflection of what we are within. Thank you for listening. This is Mike Adams, founder of DivinityNow.com, a website about conscious cosmology. Please join me there for more explorations of consciousness, quantum physics, philosophy, the power of the mind, and the nature of reality.